Pulling up to Mickey D's just for drinks? Oh yeah, that's me. Nothing extra, just perfection and a straw. Coming in hot for the coldest cups on the block. Because there are drinks. Then there are drinks from McDonald's.
Mix things up with any size lemonade or sweet tea for $1.49. Perfect with our classic fries. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
As soon as I got Vox's Abdallah Fayyad on the phone, the story we're about to tell you changed. So, Abdallah, we have breaking news this morning.
Yes.
The head of the Secret Service has resigned.
I just saw that, yeah.
I'd called Abdallah up to explain how the Secret Service botched things so badly at the rally where former President Trump was grazed by a bullet. Almost immediately after, much of the blame landed on the woman in charge of security for the West Wing. And until yesterday morning, that was Kimberly Cheatle. Are you surprised by this news?
Honestly, it shouldn't be surprising. Obviously, she's not directing every single event, and not every failure is necessarily because of a lapse in her judgment. But how we've seen her respond is, I think, itself disqualifying to continue on as director of the Secret Service, because she has been so reluctant to be transparent, even with lawmakers, about how the agency or even Congress should move forward in order to prevent this from happening again.
This lack of transparency Abdullah's talking about, it was on full display earlier this week when Cheatle showed up at a congressional hearing to answer lawmakers' questions.
Good morning. Today's hearing is for the American people who are seeking answers about the attempted assassination of President Trump.
By the time this hearing got started, the people in this room were pissed. They were wondering why the Secret Service hadn't spotted the shooter sooner.
And leading up to that day, let's start with the building that the shooter used to shoot President Trump from. At any point Saturday, did the Secret Service have an agent on top of that roof?
Sir, I'm sure, as you can imagine, that we are just 9 days out from this incident, and there's still an ongoing investigation. And so I want to make sure that any information that we are providing to you is factual.
You can't, okay. Why did the Secret Service not, can you answer why the Secret Service didn't place a single agent on the roof?
We are still looking into the advance process and the decisions that were made.
Okay.
Then congresspeople asked about new reports that Trump had been denied extra security when his team asked for it.
What I can tell you is that for the event in Butler, there were no requests that were denied. As far as requests...
Well, maybe they got tired of asking. Maybe you turned them down so darn much, they said, not worth asking. How many times did you...
A couple things stood out to me about this hearing. First of all, the attacks on Kimberly Cheatle as head of the Secret Service, they seem pretty bipartisan. People seemed pretty unified in their critique of her. And that's notable right now. The other thing that stood out to me was that Director Cheatle seemed to either not have a lot of details about what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania, where Donald Trump was hit with a bullet, or she just didn't want to answer questions yet. And that stood out too, because the whole point of her being there was to answer questions.
Exactly. There's just this aversion to any kind of accountability when something goes sideways.
And Abdallah says this aversion to accountability, it's been a problem for years.
The Secret Service does have, a long history of not being exactly transparent with the people it needs to be transparent with, let alone the public. There have been other instances and other failures that we've seen, in the last decade or two that kind of reflect this lack of willingness to actually interrogate and understand what happens at the Secret Service and why this stuff keeps happening.
Today on the show, why the Secret Service's long history means kicking out the person in charge is only the beginning. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming. Like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking and your car fan is blasting, all while you're trying to find the perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy, like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work of comparing rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try, and you might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy. All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverages you want, like comprehensive and collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies, all lined up and ready to compare so it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play on comparing auto rates. Quote at Progressive.com to join the over 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. This show is brought to you by Discover. Have you heard about Doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It's extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back into $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard. Can you tell me about the origins of the Secret Service? Like, I think a lot of people think of them as the guys in sunglasses and, listening to things in their ear around the president. But that's not all they do or all they've historically done, right?
Exactly. The Secret Service, was originally founded to combat fraud and counterfeit money. And that is still part of its mission to this day. It still investigates financial crimes and bank fraud, and that's a big part of its work. That's why all the way up until 2003, the Secret Service was actually stationed in the Treasury Department.
It's in the Department of Homeland Security now, right?
Exactly. So after 9/11, the Secret Service was moved over to the Department of Homeland Security because there was this effort to kind of put all security agencies under one blanket. That's for better or worse. They're now in a massive, department where they're kind of just embedded among a huge workforce of over 250,000 people. And there is a legitimate question of whether or not that's the best, department that it should be housed in.
I feel like I started to hear about the Secret Service being a little messy during the Obama administration. Like in 2011, there was this incident where a gunman actually fired multiple shots at the White House. And it wasn't discovered for days that he actually did reach the White House with the bullets. Can you walk me through what happened and how the Secret Service failed to prevent that attack?
Initially, the Secret Service deemed that as just a gunman outside the White House, that it was unrelated, that it was not a targeted event, that it was not targeted at the White House. And it actually took them days to find the damage to the White House done by the bullets fired at it. And they only were able to find that evidence of damage after a housekeeper came to them because she noticed broken glass and cement as a result of one of the bullet holes. I think one of the things about this incident that highlights the problems with the Secret Service is, first and foremost, they clearly did not do a thorough sweep of the grounds of the White House to actually understand what happened in the immediate aftermath of that event. And the second problem with that incident was, not only did they fail to understand what had happened, but they also took days to raise the issue to their superiors. The president, for example, and the first lady did not learn of the gunman incident for days.
Did they get called on the carpet for that? Because I imagine if you're president, you're relying on these people to protect you. So it's a little awkward to yell at them, be like, you're not doing your job, and freak out, but at the same time, totally necessary. So who did freak out? Did anyone freak out?
Absolutely. I mean, and the Washington Post reporter Carol Leonnig has done a lot of work covering the Secret Service. She's written a whole book on it. And she highlighted in one of her pieces for the Post at the time, one of the things that she raised, was that there was a lot of anger directed at the Secret Service. Michelle Obama, for example, was incredibly angry. Neither her nor the president at the time were at the White House when shots were fired, but their daughters were.
Oof. Yeah, I mean, after this incident happened, like immediately after, within a year, there was a whole other incident where I think the Obamas had gone to Colombia on a visit. The Secret Service went with them. And, they were sent back because they hired sex workers while they were there. And then in 2015, drunk agents crashed a car into the White House barricade. Like, all of this just seems to point to a toxic culture inside the agency.
Exactly. And the reporter I mentioned, Carol Leonnig, has also kind of reported a lot on this quote unquote frat boy work culture at the Secret Service. And, if agents are behaving this way on trips, it does make you wonder whether or not they are actually capable of protecting the president, protecting the vice president, their families or candidates. And if they're actually succeeding at their job, or if oftentimes, as was the case at the Trump rally, that they're getting lucky, because I think it's clear that what happened was not a situation where the president was saved because of the skill of the Secret Service, but by sheer dumb luck that he is still alive.
Yeah, the management is important because there was also an incident after January 6th that really called into question how the people in charge of the Secret Service were operating. Because right after the riot at the Capitol, Secret Service agents' text messages were deleted, which is highly suspicious, given that those could be, maybe should be used in some kind of evidence for what happened on that day.
What happened on January 6th has to be, a huge stain and big red flag for how the Secret Service is running itself and what the expectations of the Secret Service have been. In the days before January 6th, we don't have a record of their agents' text messages. They, suspiciously deleted all the messages and then blamed it on some internal software change that the agency was undergoing. But, even if that is true, even if what they say is 100% true, is it not alarming that one of the most important security agencies in the country just lost so much of its data and can't retrieve evidence for what happened on January 6th because, they were just changing software?
Yeah, this is different than like having evidence stored in a locker in a basement that gets flooded. This is like deleted immediately after the events occur.
Exactly. So even if we take the Secret Service at their word, which, we should always be skeptical of any agency's kind of response to something because, that's our job as journalists. Congress should be skeptical as well. But if we were to take the Secret Service at their word that this was a kind of software issue, that's still a very alarming problem for the Secret Service. But it's also just generally something that we still have never really gotten a full answer on. Why were those texts actually deleted? And why have we not been able to retrieve them? And what exactly was the Secret Service doing in the days before January 6th? And what exactly was the Secret Service doing on January 6th? Because everything that we've learned about January 6th and the Secret Service's role in providing security, what we've known publicly is not flattering for the Secret Service. This is a massive law enforcement agency tasked with, one of the biggest jobs of any security agency in the country. It has the ability to surveil. It has, the ability to essentially infringe on citizens' rights in their surveillance. And we need to make sure that there's oversight to prevent that kind of misconduct from happening from any law enforcement agency, let alone a big one.
When we come back, how this dysfunction seemed to come to a head in Butler, Pennsylvania.
This episode is brought to you by Washington Wise. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear stories making news right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen. This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI will not help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, or identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, or automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations. So you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
I want to talk through what we do know about how the Secret Service failed to protect Donald Trump at his Butler County rally. First of all, when you lay out the facts of where the shooter was and how long he had to take aim at the former president, how many shots he was able to fire, it doesn't seem like a sophisticated operation. It seems like something that was preventable. I feel like we know more from the press than anyone. Like, the New York Times is like sending drones out to see what it looked like, making maps, doing videos, all those sorts of things. Can you walk me through all those details?
So there are a couple of details here that I think are really important for people to understand. Onlookers noticed that there was a man on the roof with a gun. He was also reported to local law enforcement, which helped the Secret Service secure the event. And then they noticed him on the roof with a gun, something that the Secret Service at that point had realized was happening. And Trump was, still allowed to remain on the stage for over a minute after that was flagged. We also know that there were, I believe, a dozen law enforcement snipers located in the building that this gunman was sitting atop.
So they were inside and he was on top. And the head of the Secret Service, Kimberly Cheatle, said that their own agents, law enforcement, wasn't on that roof because it was sloped and therefore dangerous, which is a strange response.
Of course, that is a very strange response. And, it makes you wonder whether or not the president should be then allowed to be near buildings with sloped roofs if that's their security protocol, that they just don't go up on those roofs, which on its face just seems like a ridiculous thing. If a gunman can be on that roof, then so too can the Secret Service. And I think in the aftermath of the rally as well, you saw the Secret Service try to pass on some of the blame to local law enforcement because they do work in conjunction with local law enforcement to secure these events. And in the outside perimeter, local law enforcement was responsible. However, the commanding agency is the Secret Service at those events, even outside the perimeter. Now, another detail that I think is very alarming for how the Secret Service secured that event itself is that the gunman was within 400 feet of the president with a gun, an AR-15 style rifle, which is very common to have among a lot of Americans. And that has, I believe, a 600-foot range. So, if that is a common firearm in the United States, why is it that the outside perimeter, was within firing range of that firearm?
There's also this fact that Donald Trump had gotten increased Secret Service protection in the days leading up to this assassination attempt because of an unrelated plan by Iran to assassinate him. And this rally still unfolded the way it did. What does that tell you about how the Secret Service works and does what they have to do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's part of the reason why I'm, skeptical myself of the talking point that, part of the failure is because, they don't have enough resources, because they were aware of a threat. They had the resources to secure that event if they needed to secure it more. The question is whether or not they were actually paying attention and whether they were, actually focused at keeping Trump protected, keeping their protectees protected, whether they were, managing themselves well and directing their resources correctly, whether they were actually focused on this, or whether they were asleep at the wheel.
Some of my listeners might hear our conversation and think there are plenty of dangerous situations that the Secret Service is managing that we don't know about. Like, we only hear about it when they screw up. We basically don't know the denominator of this fraction. We know when stuff goes wrong. What would you say to someone who says that?
I think that's a very good point, and I think that's a totally valid thing to say. But the reality is that we should have extremely high standards for all of our law enforcement agencies, including the Secret Service, and not simply just give them a pass when they fail, even if they fail, the minority of times, even if it's very rare that they fail. Because the reality is, when you look at any other law enforcement agency, chances are day in and day out, they're doing their job relatively effectively. The vast majority of traffic stops, for example, end with somebody getting a ticket and nothing going sideways. But does that mean that we ignore, the minority of incidents where somebody gets shot in a traffic stop? Absolutely not. Those are huge failures. And those are things that these law enforcement agencies have to be held accountable for. And the Secret Service is no different. I don't know if the part of the reason they're not transparent is because, they worry about national security threats. I can understand why they don't want to tell us about all the plots against former presidents or their protectees. But part of that lack of transparency does lead us to not really understand, the scale of failures that happen day in and day out, or the scale of successes.
So you and I are talking at this very particular moment. The head of the Secret Service, Kimberly Cheatle, is out. But that's not the only thing that's changed in the last few days, because now Kamala Harris, the vice president, is running for president. And it strikes me we're just at this really fragile juncture. Like, protecting the first Black female candidate for the presidency is a big job. Is the Secret Service ready for that assignment?
Yeah, the point you raise is, I think absolutely important. People should ask that question. What we do know is that, for example, Obama received more death threats than his predecessors as the first Black president. So chances are, there is a lot of hatred, anger, resentment, and racism directed at Kamala Harris as she runs for office. And there probably is going to be, as we've seen in the alt-right and in far-right circles, there has been a larger and larger appetite for political violence. So I think there is a lot more danger and a much bigger threat for presidential candidates, including and especially somebody like Kamala Harris right now, than maybe in the past.
Is removing Kimberly Cheatle a fix for these politicians who are now in the mix?
It's absolutely not a fix. Having the Secret Service director resign is something that needs to be done for accountability, but that alone is not enough to fix its problems. Of course, there has to be a very thorough investigation over what happened at Trump's rally, but lawmakers would be wrong to just focus on that rally. I think they have to zoom out. They have to look at how this agency has been managing itself. They have to look at all of its problems. They have to look at these past failures and see them as part of a pattern that hasn't really been answered for at all. And so having the Secret Service director resign is a good step in accountability, but it's not a solution in and of itself. It's good that future directors know that there is accountability when something goes wrong. It might make them want to run a tighter ship. So that's part of the solution. But certainly there needs to be a lot more work done in overhauling how the agency runs itself. And that starts with Congress asking really serious questions about how the agency has been running itself well before what happened at the Trump rally.
Abdallah, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Abdallah Fayyad is a policy correspondent over at Vox. And that's our show. If you're a fan of What Next, the best way to support our work is to join Slate Plus. Go on over to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. What Next is produced by Paige, Osburn, Elena, Schwartz, Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. We are led by Alicia Montgomery, with a little boost from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you back here next time. This show is brought to you by Discover. Have you heard about Doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It's extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back into $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.